The dealer barely looked up from his parts catalog. Ray Detmer had driven 40 minutes from his family's spread outside Fairbank, Iowa, on a Tuesday morning in late October, 40 minutes, gravel roads the whole way, to ask one question. Could the engine in his grandfather's 1941 Oliver 70 be made to run again? The tractor had been parked in the family's east barn for somewhere close to 22 years. Rain had found the gaps in the siding. Mice had nested in the air filter. The fuel tank was dry and pocked with surface rust on the inside walls, and the last person who had turned the crank was Ray's father, a man who had died in 1987 without ever explaining why he stopped. Ray was 63 years old, and he had a reason to try. The dealer, a heavy-set man behind a plywood counter in Waverly, set down his pen and gave the tractor's age the look you give a stray dog that wandered in off the highway. He said something Ray would not forget. He said, "Son, now that engine's been dead longer than some marriages." The remark landed and sat there. Ray didn't argue. He thanked the man and drove home, but the comment had done something the dealer probably hadn't intended. It had made the question personal. The Oliver 70 that sat in that barn wasn't just a piece of agricultural iron. It was the tractor Ray's grandfather, Harold Detmer, had purchased new in the spring of 1942 from a dealer in Independence, Iowa. Harold had used it to break ground on every new acre the family added during the war years, when labor was scarce and the government was telling farmers to plant every inch of available soil. Corn, oats, soybeans. Harold worked that Oliver through wet springs and dry summers, through early frosts and late harvests, and the machine had not once let him down in over 3 decades of field work. The 6-cylinder engine, displacing 201 cubic inches, running at its governed 1,500 revolutions per minute ceiling, yet had pulled 2 bottom plows through black Iowa clay that would have stalled lesser machines. It had run on 70-octane gasoline and outlasted 2 other tractors that shared the farm during the same years. When Harold finally retired from farming in 1971 at the age of 79, he didn't sell the Oliver. He parked it. 22 years is a long time for a cast-iron engine to sit. In that span of 2 decades, the carburetor jets had gummed solid. The coolant passages were dry and calcium-scaled. The valve stems had likely seized in their guides from lack of oil film and oxidation, and the piston rings, if they were still in place, had almost certainly bonded to the cylinder walls. But there was something else in that east barn besides a broken machine. There was a notebook. Ray had found it tucked behind the tractor's left rear wheel, inside a rusted Maxwell House coffee tin that his grandfather had apparently used as a weather-sealed parts box. The notebook was Harold's maintenance log, a handwritten record of every oil change, every carburetor cleaning, every valve adjustment performed on the Oliver from 1942 until the tractor's last recorded service entry in the autumn of 1969. The handwriting was careful and precise. Every entry was dated, every quantity noted, quarts of oil, gallons of coolant, timing adjustments in degrees. Harold had treated the service record of that tractor the way some men treat a ledger. Nothing invented, nothing approximate. Every number earned. And if you want to see whether an 80-year-old engine that everyone said was finished could turn over and fire on the first pull, stay with us. See that subscribe button? It's our exchange. Your way of saying this reached you. Hit subscribe if this story resonated. Drop a like if it moved something in you. And tell us in the comments whether you've ever seen a machine come back from the dead or tried it yourself. Back to Ray Detmer and that Oliver 70 waiting in the dark. But to understand how this happened, we have to go back. The Oliver 70 that Harold Detmer brought home in the spring of 1942 was not a new design by any measure. Oliver Farm Equipment Company, born from the 1929 merger of Hart-Parr Tractor Works, Oliver Chilled Plow Works, Nichols and Shepard, and the American Seeding Machine Company, had introduced the Oliver Hart-Parr 70 in 1935. By the time Harold signed his purchase papers, the machine had already been in production for 7 years. That track record was part of what drew him to it. The 70 was a six-cylinder machine at a time when most competing tractors of its price class ran four-cylinder engines, and that distinction meant something in a row crop field. The inline six produced a smoothness of power delivery that the four-cylinder alternatives simply could not match. No vibration through the steering wheel after a 12-hour day. Harold had run a neighbor's Farm All H for a season and come home with his hands tingling on summer evenings. He didn't intend to repeat that experience. The Oliver 70 cost him more. He bought it anyway. The machine Harold brought home weighed approximately 4,370 pounds and carried a 16-gallon fuel tank. Its six-cylinder engine, a 201 cubic inch overhead valve unit running on 70-octane gasoline, was governed to a maximum of 1,500 revolutions per minute. At the Nebraska Tractor Test, an independent certification program that had been evaluating farm tractors since 1920, the Oliver 70 had recorded 30.37 horsepower at the PTO and 28.63 at the drawbar. What was exceptional was the consistency with which they were delivered. A torque curve that held flat and steady across the rev range, pulling hard at low RPM in the way that fieldwork actually demands. Harold noticed this difference on his first full day of plowing. He was running a two-bottom plow through the south field, a stretch of heavy loam that hard-panned 2 feet down, and the Oliver simply walked through it. Not fast, not flashy, steady. Harold farmed through the 1940s and 1950s with that Oliver as his primary tractor. He added a Farm All Super M in 1953 for additional drawbar horsepower, and a John Deere 60 arrived in 1958 to handle row cultivation and light hauling. But the Oliver 70 remained the machine he returned to when the work was serious. The other tractors came and went. The Oliver stayed. By 1960, the machine was 19 years old. Harold's maintenance notebook showed he had replaced the carburetor once, in 1956, when the original Zenith unit had developed an accelerator pump failure. He had rebuilt the magneto twice. The valve guides had been reamed and refit in 1961 by a machinist in Fairbank named Eldon Trout, a man Harold described in his notebook simply as a careful man with iron. The last entry in Harold's notebook was dated September 14, 1969. The notation was brief. Checked timing, cleaned sediment bowl, oil good. Plugs gapped at .025. Ready. Ready for what? The notebook did not say. Harold would have been 77 years old that autumn. Sometime in the winter of 1969 or the early spring of 1970, the Oliver 70 made its last trip under its own power, a short drive to the east barn, and did not come out again. Harold's son, Donald, who ran the farm from 1970 until his own death in 1987, never appears in the maintenance log. Not one entry. Donald farmed with a John Deere 402 that he had financed in 1969. The Oliver 70 was his father's machine, and he seems to have understood that on some level it was not his to use. Ray had asked him once, in the early 1980s, why his grandfather's tractor just sat there. And Donald had said, without looking up from what he was doing, "That's your granddad's business, not mine." Ray Detmer had grown up watching that tractor from a distance. As a boy in the 1960s, he remembered his grandfather driving it. Remembered the particular sound of the six-cylinder at low throttle, a sound he later described as not loud, just present, like something breathing. He remembered sitting on the fender well as a very young child while Harold ran a disc harrow across the south field. Yet he remembered the way the machine smelled. Hot iron, gasoline, something organic from the dust it kicked up from the worked soil. When Ray took over the farm in 1992 following his own father's death, his capital was committed to equipment that actually worked. The Oliver sat. But Ray didn't sell it and didn't scrap it. He did something smaller. He went to the East Barn once a year, always in October, the month Harold had made his last notebook entry, and he stood beside the machine for a few minutes. That annual visit was a kind of accounting. He was keeping track of something he wasn't ready to name. The decision to try a restoration came in the spring of 2022. Ray's wife, Connie, had been listening to him talk about the Oliver for 30 years. One evening in March, Connie put Harold's maintenance notebook on the kitchen table in front of Ray and said nothing. Ray looked at it. He looked at her. She said, "He kept that thing perfect for 27 years. Well, the least you can do is find out." Ray called a retired tractor mechanic named Dale Fink the next morning. Dale had spent 31 years as a service technician at a regional Case IH dealership in Waterloo, Iowa, and he had rebuilt engines on machines that had been sitting in fields and under snowdrifts since the Eisenhower administration. He was not a man who trafficked in optimism or pessimism. He was a man who went and looked. Dale said only, "What year is the engine?" Ray told him 1942. Dale said, "Those are good castings. I'll come by Saturday." Dale Fink arrived at the Detmer farm on a cold Saturday in early April. He walked into the east barn, stood in front of the Oliver 70 for perhaps 3 minutes without touching it, then crouched and looked at the underside of the engine block. He turned the crankshaft by hand using a breaker bar on the front crank bolt, applying steady pressure and fully expecting it to be frozen. It was tight, not seized, tight. Yet there is a specific difference between a seized engine and a stiff one, and Dale had felt it often enough to know the distinction by feel alone. A seized engine is immovable. A stiff engine needs persuasion. It has resistance, but resistance has a direction. It wants to move. Dale stood up and said to Ray, "It's not seized. It's going to take some time, but this engine is not dead." The restoration plan Dale laid out was methodical and conservative. Yet nothing would be replaced that did not need replacement. Nothing would be machined that could be cleaned. The goal was not a show tractor. The goal was an engine that started and ran on its original castings, with its original 6 cylinders turning on their original crankshaft throws. They started with the carburetor, a Carter carburetor that had replaced the original Zenith in 1956, per Harold's notebook. Dale pulled it, disassembled it on a clean cloth on the barn workbench, and found the accelerator pump diaphragm collapsed and the main jet passable but partially varnished. A rebuild kit was sourced from an antique engine supplier in Indiana. The fuel tank was removed, cleaned with a tank sealer kit, and refitted. Dale worked on Saturdays and occasional weekday mornings when his schedule allowed. The barn had no heat. April in Iowa is not kind. The magneto was the next obstacle. Any of the Oliver 70 used a magneto ignition system, a self-contained electrical generator that produced the high-voltage spark required to fire the cylinders, independent of any battery. Harold had rebuilt this magneto twice, the last time in 1963, and it had sat untouched for 59 years. Dale removed it from the engine and brought it to an automotive electrical specialist in Cedar Falls, a retired shop owner named Gerald Moss, who had been working on magnetos since the late 1950s. Gerald tested the magneto under load. It found the condenser had failed, a common failure mode for units this age, and replaced it along with the breaker points. The coil tested within tolerance. Gerald charged Dale $40 for the work, which Dale considered the best $40 spent in the entire project. The original unit, 62 years old, reconditioned by a craftsman. That distinction mattered to Ray when Dale explained it. It would matter more later. The cooling system was cleaned and flushed. The radiator was removed. I pressure tested by a radiator shop in Waterloo and found to have one small internal leak at a lower tank seam, repaired with a soft solder patch. New radiator hoses were sourced from an antique tractor supply. The water pump was freed from its seized shaft, resealed, and reinstalled. The oil system received fresh 30-weight motor oil, 4 quarts into the crankcase, along with a new spin-on oil filter adapter. The engine had now received new fuel, new coolant, a rebuilt carburetor, a reconditioned magneto, fresh plugs gapped to specification, and 4 quarts of clean oil. There was one test remaining. The morning of June 4th, 2022 was overcast and cool. The kind of Iowa morning that smells like rain that hasn't arrived yet. Ray had been awake since 5. Dale arrived at 7:15, and they spent the first hour going over every connection one more time. Every fuel line, every ignition wire, every coolant hose clamp. Dale primed the carburetor float bowl with fresh gasoline using a squeeze bottle. Yet he turned the ignition switch and listened for the fuel pump. It clicked. It was working. Dale looked at Ray. Ray looked at the Oliver 70. The tractor had not made a sound under its own power since sometime in 1969 or 1970. It was now the summer of 2022. The engine block had been cast in approximately 1941. 80 years, give or take. Ray turned the key to the start position. The starter motor engaged, a sound like a dentist drill at the edge of hearing, a rising in pitch. The crankshaft turned, the pistons moved. The carburetor fed fuel into the manifold. It fired on the first compression stroke. Not after 3 attempts. Not after cranking for 30 seconds. On the first compression stroke, the spark plug in cylinder number 1 ignited the fuel-air mixture, and the 6-cylinder Oliver 70 started. The exhaust note came out of the stack pipe above the hood, low and deliberate, yet the exact cadence that Ray remembered from standing in the south field as a boy, listening to his grandfather work. For approximately 8 seconds, neither man spoke. Then Dale Fink, who had rebuilt engines in barns and shops across northeastern Iowa for 31 professional years, said very quietly, "Well, there she is." The engine ran rough for the first 90 seconds, normal for a long idle rebuild. Then it smoothed. The governor found its idle speed and held it at approximately 650 revolutions per minute. And it did not overheat. It did not produce smoke. It did not leak. It ran. Ray Detmer drove the Oliver 70 out of that east barn on June 4th, 2022, for the first time in more than 5 decades. He drove it slowly down the farm lane, a gravel track that runs between the windbreak trees his grandfather had planted in 1937. And turned it into the south field, the same ground Harold had broken with this machine in the spring of 1942. Yet he stopped the tractor at the far end of the field and sat on the seat for perhaps 10 minutes. When he drove back to the barn, he said to Dale, who was waiting by the barn door, "He kept it ready." Dale nodded. That phrase, "he kept it ready," referred to the final entry in Harold's maintenance notebook. Checked timing, cleaned sediment bowl, oil good, plugs gapped at .025, ready. Harold had known on September 14th, 1969, that he was making a final entry, and he had left the engine in start condition. He had been waiting for someone to come back and turn the key. The Oliver 70 has been running reliably since June 2022. Ray has taken it to 3 county-level antique tractor shows in northeastern Iowa. At the first show, in Waverly, the same town where the dealer had dismissed the engine 2 years earlier, a retired Oliver mechanic named Ed Swihart stood beside the running tractor for a long time, and then said that the 6-cylinder at idle sounded exactly as he remembered it from his first service job in 1958. He said he hadn't heard that sound in 30 years. Ed was 81 years old. He had worked on Oliver 70s when they were 10 years old, and new service calls still came in from farms that had them in regular use. But he knew the engine by its acoustic signature the way a doctor knows a heartbeat, the particular phasing of 6 cylinders at low RPM, the sound of each exhaust pulse in sequence, the quiet between them. Ray let him sit in the seat. Ed sat there for a while. He didn't drive it. He just sat. That was enough. The Oliver 70 is a machine that belongs to a specific and unrepeatable chapter of American agricultural history. It was introduced in 1935, so when horse-drawn equipment still worked roughly 30% of American farmland. The 6-cylinder engine, developed at a time when most row crop competitors were satisfied with 4, represented an engineering choice that prioritized endurance over simplicity. It was harder to make. It cost more to produce. It ran smoother, lasted longer, and rewarded careful maintenance with service life measured in decades rather than years. Harold Detmer provided that maintenance faithfully From 1942 until 1969, 27 years of quarterly oil changes, annual valve adjustments, and the kind of small, careful interventions that accumulate into mechanical longevity. He gave the engine everything it needed. The engine gave the farm everything it had. That is not a complicated transaction. It is, however, a rare one. The Oliver 70 still belongs to Ray Detmer. It is kept in the East Barn, the same building that held it for 22 years of silence. But now the barn door is left unlatched. The machine is in running condition. Harold Detmer kept that engine ready for someone who might come back and know what to do. Ray came back. He knew what to do. If this story moved something in you, please like this video and subscribe to Tractor Junkie USA. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. That old iron deserves witnesses.